All right, so we are here on noon now. So welcome everyone who's here already and anyone else who comes on in. We will, I'll go ahead and put some more information in the chat for you as we go along. But welcome. Today we are doing our webinar as a roundtable on the Humanitas series. So first, what I'll do here is I'll give some introductions for everyone in our group here, and then we will go ahead and have our talk, and both Chris, and Nate, got two Chris's, will go ahead and give us their talk. And then while that is going on, you feel free to put anything in the chat box, but also if you want a question answered at the end, go ahead and put that in the Q&A box down there. That's a lot easier for us to queue that up for answering live. And if we don't get to your question, feel free to put your email in that as well. So what we can do then is, if we can't get to it, answer you over email. So if that is of interest to you, just feel free to throw that in there. And you can also make it private as well if you just wanted to send it to one of us. And then after that, I will give you a little bit more time to do some Q&A and then some more on what is new at CAP. So yeah, and then let's see here. So I'll just get started and introduce our speakers here. So first off, Dr. Christopher Perrin, MDiv PhD, is the CEO with Classical Academic Press and a national leader, author, and speaker for the renewal of classical education. He is the author of An Introduction to Classical Education, a Guide for Parents, Greek for Children, Primer A, and co-author of the Latin for Children series. He serves as a consultant to classical Christian schools converting to the classical model, and homeschool co-ops. He is the director of the Alcuin Fellowship, former co-chair of the Society for Classical Learning, and an adjunct professor with the honors program at Messiah College and with the classical school leadership master's program at Gordon College. Chris previously served for 10 years as a headmaster of a classical Christian school in Harrisburg, PA. And then our next panelist is Nathan Antiel with MPhil, MAR, and MAT. He is an editor for Classical Academic Press. He has been involved with classical education for 15 years, teaching primary texts at the high school, college, and graduate levels. And in addition to teaching, he has designed new courses, written curriculum, and overseen teacher training. And although he has taught across the curriculum, his background in teaching has centered on Dante, Milton, Shakespeare, modernist poetry, literature, and theology in the arts. In addition to working for Classical Academic Press, he serves as the assistant editor for Principia, a journal of classical education, which has its new issue out, and that'll be on our newsletter if you're interested. Let's see, and teaches courses on pedagogy and the history and philosophy of education at Thales College, and assists graduate courses for the Masters of Arts in Classical Teaching MAT program for the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. His writing has been published in Principia, the Close Reading blog at Slant Books, and First Things. And then our final panelist here is Christopher Maiocca. He's the series editor of Humanitas, and he received a Master of Arts from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. And since graduating from there, he has taught at 3 classical schools and currently resides in Boise, Idaho. Awesome. So with all those introductions out of the way, I'll hand it over to you guys. And for everyone who's just come in since, feel free to put anything in the chat box and put your questions in the Q&A box as well if you would like them answered live at the end. I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thank you, Megan. Boy, as she was reading everything you guys have done, I thought, okay, you probably should slow down a little bit. So the three of us come to you as you can tell from our backgrounds, we come to you as educators. Each of us can't help but being a teacher. So, you know, my full-time job and Nate's full-time job is working in the publishing world, but it's educational publishing, it's classical publishing. And as you can tell from what Nate and I do, we can't stop teaching. We try to keep going. And forgive us if we start teaching you during this webinar when we're really supposed to kind of be doing something else. But I bet you're coming to us as a teacher as well. And so you're interested in what 3 educators who have been working on a humane letters curriculum think. And Chris Maiocca, we're going to have to say Chris Maiocca and Chris Perrin occasionally, just so you know what's going on here. But I'm Chris Perrin with the glasses. He's Chris Maiocca without them. Chris Maiocca had, over his teaching career, grew into the need for this curriculum. It was kind of an evolving realization that students at the high school level at some of these new classical schools were ready for and needed more direct contemplation and discussion and reflection on primary source readings in history, literature, theology, philosophy. And so he started teaching that way. And I know Nate's done the same thing. You know, we've taught in upper schools. One of the calls of the classical renewal right now is to go ad fontes again, just like did in the Renaissance. What has gone before us that is really wise, that is a treasury that we should be accessing. So to some degree, this curriculum is an attempt to do that. And I'd like to start with Chris. I'd like him to just we're going to start with a little history, give you some background, let Chris kind of describe how this evolved. And we're going to let the conversation flow a bit. So I told these guys I'd like to kind of lead this almost like it's a seminar where we might discuss some things and go back and forth. And that means we can't predict completely how this is going to go, but we will be talking about the features and benefits that we perceive that are a part of this curriculum. We'll talk about why we think a kind of primary source based humane letters curriculum is appropriate at this time. And we'll get into some of the specifics of how you do it. We'll look at the text a little bit, and we'll be handling your questions all the way through the best we can. And certainly at the end, we have 90 minutes. This will be recorded. So if you have to take off because you've got an appointment, we'll send you a link. You can see the whole thing. So if something brilliant happens in, minute 88, you'll get a chance to see that later. But go ahead and feel free to just drop in questions in the chat box. I've got that open, so I'll see them as they come. And I might try to just fold in your questions. So you might ask a kind of ad hoc question that's to the moment because Chris or Nate says something and you want to follow up on it. I'll be watching for those. But if I miss one or two or a lot of them, we'll come back. We'll come back to them. Okay. So with that as trying to set some expectations, let's turn to Chris. Chris, would you, again, maybe fill out a little bit of your own background? How did you become a classical educator? And tell us how this idea evolved.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I became a classical educator. I kind of looked at it as a calling. I was driving in a car one day listening to R.C. Sproul's broadcast, Renewing Your Mind, and he was broaching this idea of classical Christian education. And I was so smitten with the idea, I almost had to pull my car over. I think I knew at that moment that this probably lay at least in my children's future. I wasn't even married at the time, but I said if I ever had kids, this is how I wanted them to be educated. I didn't know there was another model of education that was compelling to me. I had been in sales for the first 10 years of my professional career, mostly with a company called Nestle Waters. And on my free time, I was just always reading theology and philosophy and great works of literature. So I said I should probably just leave sales and go back to school. Went to Boston or South Hamilton to study under some of my heroes at Gordon Conwell. The call to become a classical Christian educator was confirmed there. My thesis was eventually published, The Reformer's View of Education. And that was the beginning of the calling. I think some seeds were planted at Gordon Conwell. All my classes were lecture based. This was before YouTube, I think. This was probably 18 years ago. And I saw the benefits of lecture pedagogy, but I also saw some of the detriments. My favorite moments in class is when the teachers would let the students begin to interact with each other. Those are the things that I remember at my 3 years at graduate school, was when students would actually take a topic in hand and start discussing it with each other. the next 5 years of my career, I taught at a school called Harvest Academy in Northern California. And all I knew how to do was lecture. I just took that model from my graduate school. And I think there was always this haunting suspicion that this is okay, but this is not the way to engage and truly teach students. 5 years later, I was asked to go chair a humanities department, actually build the humanities department for a school that wasn't new, but it was starting a new high school. And we hired a new headmaster whose son went to a boarding school in New England who used exclusively the Socratic method. There were no there were no desks in the classrooms. There was just a Socratic table. And he gently said, I would like to transition our entire humanities department to a Socratic model. And that's when I had to start wrestling seriously with pedagogy. And that was what gave birth to Humanitas, was this need to provide curriculum for any type of classical renewal environment, but mainly for discussion-based classrooms. That was the immediate need.
Thanks for that. And so as you were starting to teach Socratically, you weren't lecturing. And what was it that you were Socratically going to discuss? So obviously you fell in love with primary sources of various kinds while you were doing in graduate school. Tell us a little bit about how that worked as you started to employ that pedagogy at the high school level.
Yeah, well, it was rough at first. I mean, I don't think initially we used traditional history textbooks that we had purchased that we had in the curriculum closet, and that was a fairly miserable experience to read, just to go through a history textbook around a table and try to discuss that. I did go out to the Humanities Institute at Phillips Exeter Academy that first summer, and they really helped me understand that the way to facilitate Socratic discussions was to really get as directly into the minds of the progenitors of these ideas directly. And I remember I was sitting in the Humanities Institute at Phillips Exeter, and a teacher from Philadelphia looked over at me and he said, so the key to making this entire thing work is to curate these primary documents so your students can directly engage these great ideas. And that's when the light bulb went on. So that next year, that would have been my second year at this school in San Diego, I was experimenting directly with primary sources. And I was having some of the greatest experiences that I've ever had as a teacher. Light bulbs were going off with the students. The classes were in my high school history class. I mean, I literally slept through it. Many students were saying that this was the most exciting class on their schedule, was their Roman and American history class, because they could actually talk and wrestle with these ideas. So what I found, Chris, was I was having great classes, but I wasn't teaching a great course because I had no organizing principle for these source documents. And it was at that time my academic dean, Dr. Jeff Pratt, he's a headmaster at a school now in Southern California. He challenged me. He said, I challenge you to create a curriculum that teaches, at this particular time, it was American history using only primary sources. And that was, I look back to that as the birth of Humanitas. It was that provocation to do something that had never quite been done in curriculum. We do have source books, but we don't have anything quite like Humanitas, to my knowledge, on the market.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to go to Nate next, but before we do that, I'm just going to once again welcome everybody who's on the call and give you a chance to just open up the chat box and tell us where you're from. And if you're a teacher or an educator of some kind, tell us what you teach and where you teach. And if you're an interested person who's not a teacher, let us know what you do as well. So let's just see who's who and where you're from. And maybe we should start a contest. The person who's from the farthest away from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, gets a. See, it's already motivating you. You don't even know what the reward's going to be. Okay, it's
Kyle
great.
is in Prescott, Arizona, and he's hopefully in an air-conditioned situation.
Yeah, that's right. All right, oh, someone from Beaumont, Texas, Joshua, great to have you with us. Yeah, I've seen you here and there online. And then we've got Isabel, Heather, who's a humanities teacher at a hybrid program.
Mandy Moore. Hi, Mandy.
We know her. And by the way, while you're reading this, Chris Maiocca is a humanities educator at the Ambrose School in Boise, Idaho. And he is right now in that lovely library, the paneled library of that school. It's a very beautiful school. Janet, welcome. Lucy, welcome. It's great to have a number of you homeschoolers and schoolers all present. That's great. Okay, thanks for being with us, everyone. Nate, let's go to you. Would you describe a bit your own experience teaching around a Socratic seminar table? And would you begin to describe as well what you found to be the benefits of teaching this way as a complement to lecturing, and maybe make a distinction between what lecturing and Socratic discussion provide in a classroom?
Sure. Well, I suppose in terms of my background with teaching Socratically, I was really lucky to cut my teeth teaching at one of the oldest classical schools in the country, the Trinity schools. So I had a not dissimilar experience to Chris in terms of kind of being brought into the wonder of primary texts, but I never had to teach otherwise. So I've always been privileged to teach primary texts, and that was demanded and expected, and I was even taught how to do that. So my career with teaching actually began as a student. We had roughly 2 weeks before the school year started, where all the humanities teachers were brought in before everybody else. And we had to read primary texts together and discuss them and learn how to have a discussion as a student. And then, terrifying thing for a brand new teacher, I actually had to lead classes with other faculty members, and I had to lead classes with students that I'd never met before in front of all of my peers. After which everybody said, "Oh, this went really well, this went poorly. I think you really misread Flannery O'Connor." And as a Protestant, it was like, yeah, isn't that like inevitable? I have no idea what's going on in Flannery O'Connor, but a really humbling experience. And I think the crux of the issue is, what's the goal in the classroom? Is the goal for you to teach, or is the goal for students to learn? And Aristotle reminds us that we have to begin with the end in mind. So the means that we take to achieve that end are going to be hugely important. And I think what lecture is really good at, lecture is really useful for, is conveying a lot of information. So I can teach an incredible amount of stuff in a short amount of time via lecture. I can deliver a lot of content. I can tell you who Dante was, when he was born, when the Commedia was actually published, what my reading of the text is, what you might look for and find for. To actually read through Dante's comedy would take an incredible amount of time. In grad school, I spent an entire year reading through the comedy. So the question is, do we want a teacher to convey as much material as possible, or do we want students to actually learn how to engage that material for themselves? And to me, that's one of the biggest differences between a sort of lecture-based approach to pedagogy in class and a primary text base. So when I lecture on Dante, students might learn things about me, And hopefully, if I lecture well, I get out of the way and it becomes less about my engagement with Dante, my interpretation of Dante, and more about Dante. Well, in the Socratic classroom, I can get out of the way pretty quickly. I think my task as the teacher is to kind of whet the student's appetite, to be for the student what Virgil is for Dante Pilgrim, a sort of guide. I put them in contact with the text. I try to get them thinking, them discussing, and pretty soon they are themselves lost in the middle of the wood, in the middle of their own lives. They begin experiencing what Dante experienced. And that's when the classical classroom, that's when the Socratic classroom really becomes magical, because the student is actually engaging as opposed to being talked at. The student is actually undergoing a different type of change. So we might also think about the difference between information and formation, the kind of practices and activities that you can have students undergo in the classroom have the potential to help make and shape them in ways that are very different than if they're just trying to learn information for the sake of a test that they can regurgitate. So that's a little bit of my background with in introduction to Socratic method, and a little bit about the difference. Hopefully that kind of, there's a lot we could say about the difference, really, but that in my mind is one of the big differences. And Chris, I actually didn't know that you were at the Exeter training. I did that myself a couple of years ago. So we'll have to chat about that offline sometime, but sounds like we had in some ways a similar experience, but then I'd love to give you some more about what happened with my experience there. But anyway.
All right.
That's why we've called this meeting, gentlemen. Yeah, so at Phillips Exeter School, it's not a Christian school, but it's kind of an old New England school. Is it New Hampshire? Okay. And it's and one of my friends, Nick Perrin, went there as a student and started, he actually got interested in Greek as a high school student. And that's also where Mark Zuckerberg went for a while, just so you know, and he got interested in Greek there. At any rate, it's one of these old schools, and they have a table that was developed by a carpenter whose last name was Harkness. And so the Harkness method is just another way of describing what you've been hearing, teaching around a big wooden table that holds about 14 people. And in the case of the Harkness table, there were these little drawers, these little slats that would pull out, and you could face back to back, and you could take an exam without being able to see one another's work. But at any rate, we're off on a pretty interesting tangent, in my opinion. We want to get around a table, and we want to be nourished directly by the great thinkers and writers. And so these two guys have grown into that, love that. And here we are talking about pedagogy, but it's appropriate because, all right, we want this pedagogy. We want some curated primary source readings. And by curated, I think we mean carefully collected and sequenced and ordered and introduced, so that students wouldn't just kind of randomly be jumping from one good writer to another, but guided by somebody who has been there and done that at least one time already. So Chris, back to you. That's what you attempted to do. You attempted to bring some harmony and order and curation to the kinds of readings that your high school students would appreciate. And that in itself was a huge amount of work. And it's one reason why people have been attracted to this curriculum already. It's because if you teach this way already and you want to bring primary source documents to your students, that's fantastic. But it's a huge amount of work to do that, to be copying, gathering, organizing, creating your own curriculum, doing that curation, getting permissions if you need them. It's a lot of work. So Chris, describe how you went about that curation.
Well, at the heart of Humanitas, I wanted it to, and this is what would separate Humanitas from just like, let's just say, a run-of-the-mill source book. I wanted it to be an unfolding narrative. So that was when I say that when I started experimenting with primary sources, I would have great classes but bad courses. What I mean by that was it was so difficult if it wasn't already before me gathering the right primary sources. Some of these, I mean, we have in one of our volumes, we have, I think, 12 documents that have never been translated into the vernacular. I'll give you one example, Hall's Chronicle, which gives us literally a primary source, first-person account of the reign of Henry VIII. Hall's Chronicle was what Shakespeare used to do most of his historical plays, or his England-based historical plays. That had never been translated into the vernacular. And so some of this is just impossible to teach. Like, you can't teach Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, which gives us really one of the first looks into this idea that government, the authority of government rests in the people. That had never been translated into intelligible modern English. So I wanted to first take some of these documents that have been locked up for centuries and now give them to our constituencies, but also do it in a way where people can see the logical progression, not only of events, but ideas. So, and when you go into a school, I think Nate will tell you that teaches like this, that doesn't have a tool like Humanitas, on Monday morning, you're going to see a bunch of panicked teachers at the in the copier room saying, you know, okay, I'm going to run off, you know, some of these letters of Washington, but, you know, unless you've carefully gone through them and you can organize them in a way that's intelligible to students, they're not going to get the great benefit out of it that they could.
Yeah, I've been that teacher, actually. There was a school just outside of DC that I taught at, and they hired me to write they called it the arts and aesthetics course, but they wanted it to be an introduction to everything related to the fine arts and beauty, as well as thinking about like philosophical and theological aesthetics. And I got there and they said, we messed up. We didn't account for the budget for your course at all. So you can't have the kids order any, you know, no books. So I had to run off photocopies of everything. But I think one of the big challenges is not, the challenge isn't whether or not there are texts available, right? So we have all sorts of different things. You have like the Perseus project that is a huge resource. You've got Fordham, you've got, you know, there's all sorts of different things that present a number of primary sources, but how do we curate those, right? So especially for a new teacher, and this is where Humanitas has the potential to be super beneficial, not only for the students, but also for school communities, right? Faculty need to be instructed as well. So, I'll use myself by way of illustration. My first year teaching, I had a BA and a master's degree, a master's in Anglo-Irish literature. Well, it turns out neither William Butler Yeats, nor James Joyce, nor Samuel Beckett, like nothing that I knew super well was what I was asked to teach. I had a BA in English and history, and I was put into an American history, humane letters. So I had to teach Huckleberry Finn, and I had read it, but I'd never been taught it. I had to teach Thoreau, which I read in high school, but I didn't read in college. I had to teach the Federalist Papers. I had to teach the Alien and Sedition Acts. I had to teach the, right? And you look at this curriculum and you go, this is so true for new teachers. You're going to be asked to teach 85 to 95% of the material that you're asked to teach is going to be stuff that you maybe have read, maybe you've come into contact with, but you're absolutely not a specialist. So you go, how do I cover American history? How do I pick enough primary sources? How do I pick accessible selections? Just take the Federalist Papers, for example. What do you teach? Do you teach Federalist 1? Do you teach 10 on faction? Do you teach 50? You know, how many are you going to do? To what extent should you think about the anti-federalist responses? So we have a couple, like I'll call them repositories of primary sources. What we don't have anywhere except for Humanitas are resources that are actually curated for the sort of scope and sequence that you would find on or in high school classes. So you go, what can a 10th grader actually do with American history? How much material can we cover? How can you put these sources together in such a way that it makes for a meaningful engagement with the American experiment? So selection is a huge thing. And teachers, when you're teaching 3 or often at some of these small classical schools, right? You have teachers that have anywhere from 3 to 5 preps. And you go, I really don't have time. I absolutely don't have time to read through everything related to American history. And how do I pick from Jonathan Edwards? How do I pick from people devote their entire careers to a single person in the curriculum? And you go, I'm a novice teacher. How do I teach the breadth of American history while accounting for all the different variants and possibilities? So I think that's a big benefit of the Humanitas program.
Thank you, Chris, and really helpful descriptions of the challenge of teaching primary sources and how we have been trying to address it. And we've worked for quite a while. I think I talked to Chris about 4 or more years ago when we first were giving birth to partnering with him to publish. And then we've spent a lot of time working this out in a great amount of detail. So it might be appropriate now to just talk a little bit about the curriculum itself and the ways it has attempted to do what Nate and Chris were just describing. It's not perfect. In fact, we regard this as kind of a 1.0. In 5 or 10 years, we'll probably learn some things and we'll make some revisions and changes. But I think it was Chris who already said there's just, or was it you, Nate? Nothing like this really exists right now that's been designed from the bottom up with curation for classically minded and classically placed high school students. So there are lots of great resources out there, no doubt. But to put these, to address these questions together in something that's published has been a challenge. It's been a puzzle and we've been working on it. And now we think we've got it kind of figured out, our modus operandi for how we're doing this. We have just finished Maiocca, which consists of 4 of these books in readers, about 250 to 300 pages each, 100, about 25 curated readings, original primary source readings in each volume. So that would be 100 readings in a year worth of American study in humane letters. I would describe it as about 80%, these texts are about 80% primary source readings and about 20% curation in the form of introductions, annotations, afterwards, historical highlights. Each reading sometimes will have 30 or 40 annotations, just giving the student additional clarity, background that will help the student to understand any given passage. And of course, they're sequenced in a particular way, as Chris was saying, to kind of roll out a narrative to help tell the story. So, but there's one other thing that we've done, and then I'm going to pass it over to Chris for some description. We've also wanted them to be beautiful. In other words, we've wanted to blend, I don't know how else to put it, but to say art history with American humane letters. So the images that occur throughout the text, yeah, I'm sorry, the text is actually kind of blurry. We haven't fixed that yet. I'm just kidding. Let me do this. Change my blur function. So there you can see. So if you haven't seen the text yet, you'll note that it's full color. We've given a good bit of real estate to drop in images that are historically pertinent and appropriate, but in their own way kind of tell the story visually of American history. Chris, let me pitch it over to you. When you're asked to describe what the features and benefits of Humanitas are, how do you summarize it for folks?
I mean, I think the question is so we're going to take a historical epoch and we're going to try to say, and this process takes traditionally 3 to 4 months. We're going to say, okay, we have for each particular course, whether it's Rome, Greece, America, medieval, we have 100 source documents where we get to tell this story. And now occasionally the chapters, like in America, there's Washington chapters, and there's one chapter could have, 15 of his letters chronologically ordered to give students a view into the war. We're going to say, okay, what are the 100 most important documents, primary source documents, to tell the story of this epoch? The most important events, people, ideas. And then we get a team of scholars, between 3 and 5 scholars, and we will debate and discuss that for, I've seen that discussion go on in this project for over 4 months. And so that's the centerpiece of this series. It's those source documents. But then we say, well, how do we help students understand that? So for me, in some ways, the engine behind Humanitas are the annotations. We ask volume editors to annotate ideas or concepts. The best way for me to explain it would be like a good study Bible. If you've ever read a study Bible, how important those notes are to give the reader historical context, define words, etc. So those are the 2 main points. All of our source documents are introduced by about 1,000-word introduction. And that is, so I look at the introductions as they hold the hands of the document that went before and the document that will go after. And it tells the student, this is exactly the significance of this document, why it's important, and how it progresses the historical story forward. We also have afterwards. We have about a 200-word afterward to say, this is what you've just read. This is why it's important, and here's how it informs what we're about to do. And then, Chris, you've already mentioned, I believe that there is a beautiful piece of art on just about every single page of the Humanitas. So students' imaginations are constantly being awakened, to read about Washington crossing the Delaware is great. It's amazing, especially when he tells it from his experience, but to see that great piece of art of him crossing the Delaware or whatever it is, that's what I wanted. And I do thank Classical Academic Press for making this full color. I know that wasn't an easy financial decision, but I do appreciate that.
Oh, it's so very much worth it. And now I think it'd be appropriate just to show you some images of the text. Some of you haven't yet seen them. So let me share my screen and I will show you something. You can see images of the text by going to our website and just looking up the Humanitas curriculum. And then there'll be a look inside feature. When you click on it, you can actually download, gosh, it might be 50 pages. Here it is, 50 pages from the first book. You can kick the tires, if you will. So we have a list of the all of the readings are listed and described sequentially in the table of contents. We have a basic chronology at the beginning of the book. So we think the structure of dates is important, and so we do provide information that you might give in a lecture format. This is the content that Nate was talking about. We do have that in some forms, but of course the emphasis of this curriculum is going to be the primary source readings themselves. So we have an introduction written by Chris here, and then the first unit is to get to Indian origins, and then we read the myths of the Cherokee. That's how we began the first reading, and you can see the artwork that is included. We have a section called historical highlights that's inserted in every chapter to provide some additional context. One of you had asked that question. Okay, you're doing deep dives into primary source readings. Get that. But how do you how do you provide context to understand how these readings relate to other things that are happening contextually in history? That's one of the reasons we do this as well. And so then, we'll see, in this case, 2 readings and then discussion questions that follow, prompts for writing and discussion that you could use in a, around a seminar table are included in the text right there for the student to see. So some of these could be prompts that you would actually use in a discussion or maybe assigned for writing. Here's another reading on Indian polity. We have a timeline, and then we have the League of the Five Nations as a second reading here. And then I'll go to this, the third, and you can see again the historical highlights. You can see the parchment color indicates the primary source reading. But you'll see the annotations off to the side over here. And so throughout the text, each primary source reading, there are ample, generous annotations to provide guidance. There's the afterword that Chris was talking about. So that's designed to kind of make a connection as well to what's coming, so that we're creating a kind of an appropriate historical, narrative. So there you have it. That's, at least you can see our layout and function. We have finished the 4 books for Humanitas America, and our Nate and Chris and many others are busy working on Greece and Rome, and they'll be ready for the next academic year. 50 readings in Greece, 2 books, 25 readings each, and then 50 readings in Rome to comprise an entire year of study at the high school level for Greece and Rome. And we're already working on medieval, the medieval volume. In fact, our volume editor, one of them is here, Junius Johnson. He is working with Nate and Chris as we're building out the medieval volume as well. So the following year we'll have medieval, and then we're going to do modern history as well. So on the back of each book, let me just clear my blur again. You'll see, basically we're talking about 16 volumes of 16 readers over 4 years of study. Okay. Let me now just pause and let's take a look at some of these questions, Chris and Nate. I think you have the chat box open yourself. Would you just scan some of those questions, and either one of you, if you'd like to answer or address any of these questions, just jump in. And those of you who are participating, this is a good time. We're about 45 minutes in. Let's hear from you. Your questions, comments, curiosities. Go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll have some discussion.
Sure.
There's also the Q&A. I think both of you can look at the Q&A prompt. Some people have been putting their questions in the chat box, which I asked them to do, but then some have been putting them as well in that Q&A section.
Sure. Isabella just asked a question about sort of the scope of these, whether or not the curriculum is something that you go through in a year. And the answer is yes. So we have 4 years worth of curriculum that will be coming out. The American volumes, since pretty much every school in the country teaches American history, that's the first volume that's come out. So it's split into 4 different books, basically for the ease of students. Instead of having them lug around a massive book, there are 4 different books per year. So there's roughly 25 sources in each book. Now, that's a lot of material, and I think there are different ways to go about that. I have never gotten through a textbook, 100% of a textbook that I've taught. So on the one hand, you go, well, you're always given more than you can teach. The ideal would be, you get through all 100 sources. I think that because we have such different types of classical schools, there are different ways to go about how you would work through the curriculum. You might assign a single text a day. You might spend 2 or 3 days on a single text. As you look at things for American history, for instance, some people do that freshman year. Some people do that junior or senior year. So you might want to spend more time on difficult texts if you teach older students, and you might skip over some of those more difficult texts if you're teaching younger students. If you want to get through as much curriculum as possible, that might mean that some days you read text aloud in class and you assign a text for homework, and you read a text aloud in class the next day, and then you have a conversation about 3 texts at the same time. So I think the curriculum is sort of flexible enough that it can accommodate different approaches to pedagogy from a classical perspective. I think everything is kind of set up so that you can have a proper Socratic seminar about the texts. But one of the things that we're trying to do in classical ed broadly is what Mortimer Adler calls syntopical reading, having texts interact with each other. And so you can have seminars about how, for instance, in the Greece volume that I'm working on right now, we've got Heraclitus and Parmenides, followed by the Sophists, followed by Socrates critiquing the Sophists, followed by Plato and Aristotle thinking about what education actually is. So we could assign a couple of those and then have a seminar where you go, okay, we've got 4 different takes on the question of what truth is, 4 different takes on what education aims at. So you can have a seminar that deals with multiple texts at the same time. And this is where, instead of just reading about history, students actually begin to learn how to do history. They begin actually doing the kind of work that historians do, as opposed to being just consumers of information. So ideally, yes, you get through all of the American stuff in a single year for American. I suppose it also should be said that while this is a history curriculum, in that it moves through the historical narrative, and we essentially move from earlier in history to later in history, we've called it Humanitas in large part because we're moving beyond just the sort of basic generic distinctions that the modern academy has established. So we get a Department of English that really doesn't interact with the Department of History, that really doesn't interact with the political science department. This is not how the ancient Greeks thought about texts. It's certainly not how the early American authors thought about texts. So in that sense, it is more of a humanities-based curriculum. So the Greek volume is going to have excerpts from Homer and Hesiod, in addition to some of the philosophers, in addition to Herodotus and Thucydides, the actual histories. So we're not only putting texts in conversation with other texts, we're also setting students up so that they can begin thinking about the Greek experiment like the Greeks thought about themselves. So some of these hermetically sealed disciplines in the academy, we're saying, well, they're really a lot more porous than that. And that's kind of an arbitrary construction. So let's let the text speak for itself and interact with different kinds of texts.
Thank you, Nate. I'm going to pitch it over to you, Chris, but I'll make just a quick comment. Yeah, this is designed to be a service and a source to you as a teacher. And that means, as Nate was really implying, you rule over it. It doesn't rule over you. If you are a magister, if you're the king of your classroom, you will use this to the ends that you're seeking, rather than to be a servant. So you don't have to do all 100 or else. We're not saying that, but here it is. It's a curated collection of great historical narratives, literary narratives, political science, and it can be used by you. There's nothing saying. In fact, we recommend that probably you use some other things as your wisdom leads you. You might want to. We have an excerpt from Ben Franklin's autobiography. You might want to assign the entire autobiography to your students if you happen to be teaching, say, a 90-minute block, 4 to 5 days a week, doing humanities, humane letters, meaning that you have time to do read novels, read poetry, read. Some schools are doing just that. That might not be your school. You might be teaching 3 days a week for 45 minutes. You'll have to use this resource in a different way. Some of you have already mentioned, one of you is teaching 1 day a week. The way you would use this resource if you're teaching 1 day a week will be different than the person who has 90 minutes, 5 days a week. So, but here it is. It's an offering, and you'll have to also do some thinking about how it fits. Back to you, Chris. As you've been looking at some of these questions, either in the Q&A box or the chat box, what would you like to address?
Joshua Butcher asked several questions in the Q&A. So there's 5 questions in the Q&A. A lot of the other ones are off to the side in the webinar chat. Joshua, really quick, the difference between Harkness and Socratic. Chris Perrin's done a lot of work on that. And I know that you have a PowerPoint from a couple years ago, from a Society of Classical Learning. I don't know if you can make that available. So
Sure.
Josh, I think the most challenging question that Joshua asks is what principles of selection went into the choices for the Humanitas texts? Well, I can assure you, Joshua, that no one's going to be 100% satisfied with all of the selections. We ask questions. I mean, some are obvious, like there's some texts that are just obviously going to be in these volumes. For example, it would be difficult to tell the story of America without giving us the primary account of the Pilgrims coming over. Other questions, for example, like let's say when we start to get up to the American Revolution, what were some of the powder kegs that caused this thing to result in a war? We know that in hindsight, like we might not say, the Boston Massacre, for example, 4 people perished. So by what historical standards is that a massacre? But to the people of New England, that was a big deal. That was something that they used to further this argument of expelling Great Britain. So we said, well, we have to include the Boston Massacre because to those people, that was a critical event that precipitated the war. Then you have a challenge. You have over 100 Boston Massacre orations. So which one do you choose? And you need somebody to read through all those Boston Massacre orations and say, this was the most historically significant, the most rhetorically beautiful, and the most important for the time. So that's a very difficult question to answer, Joshua, but roughly, each volume, 3 to 4 months of debate with some of the top scholars in a field. And some of those debates are very vigorous. And we finally have to settle on 50 to 100 texts or 100 texts for one historical epoch. Not easy.
It also changes, right, from period to period. So the principles that guide how we think about America are different from the ones that guided our selections for Greece and Rome. Yeah.
Let's hit a few just very practical items that I know some of you are thinking about. Some of you have asked about what other resources come with the Humanitas curriculum. So there is a teacher's edition that's coming. And I think it was Debbie said, I've ordered mine because we had a pre-order and it hasn't come out yet. I know it is coming. We're working on that. We've been prioritizing, making sure we got the student text out in time. The first 2 have been printed and the other 2 are at the printer and coming in a matter of weeks. And then we'll turn our attention to finishing up, and we're working on it simultaneously, but getting those the teacher editions to you before the school year begins. And we know it's getting tight. So that's the answer to your question, Debbie. Texts, quizzes, are there other things? The teacher's edition has a number of resources like that. The prompts that come at the end of each chapter, the discussion and writing prompts, are a significant way that you can use those for assessment. And they're not each of those lists is not exhaustive. You will probably create good question and writing prompts yourself as you're teaching the course. So that we recommend that you do that you be engaged doing that. We'll probably be creating in time an online project or website where people can share their ideas, share assessments, share how they're using this resource. So there's that. But here's another practical matter, a cost. And how do you use this? A number of you, who was it? One of you said, I'm teaching twice a week. Sharon said, this is hard to do with only 2 hours a week face-to-face. Has anyone solved that time issue? This is always an important question. because hybrid schools are co-teaching with parents. So this means if you're using this resource in a hybrid school, you want to familiarize parents as teachers so that they will be using this at home, doing the readings with their students, having discussions with students in the home setting as well. Of course, there's reading time that you can assign at home, so that, as Nate's saying, you might have 2 or 3 readings assigned that are done outside of class and then brought back. There'll be a number of ways I think you could divide and conquer to do that. And there's nothing saying you have to do all 100 readings. So you might curate the curation according to the limits of your time. You could use this book with a textbook if you wanted to. Let's just say you're teaching in an AP history course, which there's reasons why I wouldn't recommend doing AP history, but that's a separate, completely separate tangent. Can be good for some students, but often it's a problem. But at any rate, let's just say you're teaching AP history at a private school and you're meeting 5 days a week and they have a required text that you're using. Could you use these primary source readings as a complement to any textbook? The answer is yes, you could. As we've already said, there is some textbook qualities in these readers in the form of the annotations, introductions, afterwards, and some other material. But it's about 80% primary source readings. So we're not saying that there isn't room for the lecture, for context, for giving introductions and surveying the field. Of course, you'll do that as a teacher anyway, but that's not where we err. That is where we err. We err on the other side of neglecting reading primary source reading. So we're trying to correct that. Back to Chris and Nate. Would you say anything further about how you would practically use this? Oh, one more comment from me. How do we compare with Veritas Omnibus program, for example? People have asked that, and it's a great question because we have seen that curriculum and we admire it. It has done a lot of good for the classical renewal over the last, say, 10 or 15 years. But that curriculum does is it's like 80% text, and then Omnibus would then require you to go get 14 or 15 books that you would have to purchase for your students. And then you would have to curate those, read maybe not 100% of those books, but portions of those books in some cases. But you see the difference, like one way or another, you're trying to curate readings, and Veritas Omnibus is trying to do that, and good for them. They're aware of this issue. We have to get good literature in the hands of students. But we think this is another alternative way to do that could be equally good or better, and that is to curate the readings in these volumes. And that would mean you would not have to order 14 books. So from a cost perspective, you could probably cut in half, even if you're teaching a 90-minute block, cut in half the number of whole books that you would have to purchase for students. But you still want to do that with some, right? We're not suggesting that reading excerpts is all that students should be doing in their study of humanities. So we do recommend that you read entire works. But that again becomes a question of curation for you in your own setting. Okay, enough of me. Back to Chris and Nate. How can this be practically employed wisely in schools and homeschools?
Go ahead, Chris.
Forgive me, I just keep going, even though I'm spending a lot of time working in Rome right now. I'm the series editor, but I was also the volume editor for the American volume. So that's probably the most familiar content to me. So one of the ways I might hold is a Socratic discussion or an actual class period is I might send the students home and I might say, and I don't have the table of contents in front of me, but I might say, read chapter, let's say, 32, that gives the British perspective on why they felt that they had the right to tax the Americans. And then I'll say, in class, I'd like to read the the American perspective of why, like, let's say Letters from a Farmer in Philadelphia, here's the reasons why Great Britain did not have the right to tax the American colonies. And, then we'll just have, let's just say, a 30-minute discussion on the merits of those points, the merits of those arguments. So that would be a small example of how to conduct a seminar on that particular portion of history.
Thank you. Nate, as a teacher and you're thinking about practical deployment, use of a resource like this in various settings, what comes to your mind? Especially, I think someone else in the Q&A mentioned that they teach. Byron E. Wild says, I teach a 1-hour class to 11 and 13-year-olds once a week. The rest of the week, these students are in a public school system and are very used to lecture and zoning out. It's difficult to employ a Socratic method in the classroom. How do I best shift the mindset of students? How do I help them to see learning through a new paradigm? Even just helping them to see that learning is their responsibility, let alone their privilege and joy. Thank you. So, Byron's got a challenge there. He's had other challenges besides the ones we've mentioned, but thank you, Byron.
Yeah.
How would you address his question and others like it?
Taste and see is maybe one of the things that I would say. 11 through 13-year-olds are challenging no matter where they are, no matter what the background is. How do you, what you're asking after is really not only different curriculum, but like, how do I transform a student who doesn't want to learn into becoming one that wants to learn? And I think there are a few things that you can do. One, you can not treat them like they're an 11 to 13-year-old. That is to say, you can decide that you're not going to treat them as the sort of creature that needs to be spoon-fed. You can treat them as though they have something of human dignity, that they have a mind that is capable of working. And instead of giving them something that is at their level or even beneath them, you can actually dignify students by treating them as though they're serious, by treating them as though they're actually capable. And one of the ways that you do that is by giving them primary text. So Lewis has this great little bit in his preface to Athanasius on the incarnation of the Word of God, where he says, sometimes students are afraid to approach Plato out of humility. They think, here's a great man, I won't be able to understand him. So they pick up a book on Platonism. But if they only knew that Plato, because of his greatness, can actually explain himself better than a book on Platonism, then they would taste and see for themselves. So much of my career as a teacher has been addressing this very question, whether it's with 11 through 13-year-olds or with older students. How do I take an apathetic student and present them with material that will make them want to know? And there's a little poem by Walt Whitman that comes to mind. Can we do a little poetry for a moment? Whitman wrote a poem called The Learned Astronomer, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. And I think this kind of illustrates in a profound way what I'm hinting at. But he says, when I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. And you go, what's the difference here? Do I show students pictures of the stars? Do I give them definitions of what a supernova is? Or do I take them out and actually give them a sort of sensory emotional experience of the thing itself? How do you convince a 11 to 13-year-old that actually reading something is worthwhile? Read it with them, enliven it with them. So if that's Homer, that means that you as the teacher need to begin channeling. You need to chant Homer, sing Muse, the wrath of Achilles, right? And you bring them into the text, let them experience it from the inside out. And then you turn to them and say, as a fellow inquirer, what is happening here? What sets Achilles in motion such that, and they go, well, I thought you were supposed to know. And you say, well, I don't know. If I knew, I wouldn't be reading it, right? Like, this is interesting and it's amazing. So the teacher can model wonder. The teacher can model the habits, has to really, that the student hopefully will see and be inspired by. But I think Whitman points us in the right direction. The best thing that you can do is give the student something that they have to reach for, something that's actually worth coming into contact with. I don't mean to disparage other books. I don't know that my life has ever been changed by reading a textbook. I do know that my life has been changed by, listening to Beethoven, thinking about King Lear in the midst of personal tragedy. I mean, primary texts have the potential to prompt introspection, to enable you to better inhabit your own life and think about who you are. And that's how you bring students along. You give them primary texts. You treat them as though they're worthy and capable of doing something that is worthwhile, that is difficult. And then you praise them for the effort and you join them. You walk side by side with them. So I think, I don't know, I'm kind of circling around the issue, which instead of addressing it head on, but I think in a certain way, that's how you do it. You have to circle around things with students. If you can get students to recognize that class is actually a lot more fun, a lot more engaging, they learn things and they don't forget them. If they're doing them, then you've won the battle. Then they'll want to come and they'll want to do those things, and they'll grow dissatisfied with the sort of public school lecture that they're sitting in. They'll want more classes like Chris's. They'll want more good discussions. They'll want more good curricula.
Thank you so much, Nate. I think, Byron, he's answered your question well, but yes, there is the need for you to then wisely apply, given your circumstances. And I think Nate's giving you some great examples of how you could approach that, at least principially. So we have just about another 20 minutes, and we don't have to take that entire time, but we want to ensure that your questions are being answered. I think you've gotten a good sense of what we've tried to do with Humanitas, and that's to help students grow in their humanity by engaging primary source readings that are curated, annotated, and beautiful. So I think you're going to love it as a resource, whether you use it as your full-time core resource or as a supplemental one. But once again, pausing here to make sure your questions are being addressed. So looking at both the Q&A box and also the chat box.
Chris, I'm going to leave in the chat box, I'm going to leave my email. If we don't get to the questions, just consider me a resource for anything that you'd need. I'm happy to take a phone call. I'm happy to do a Zoom. My son's baseball gets over in 3 days, so I'm going to have about 30 extra hours a week. Byron, he asked a good question. How do you address weighing the rightness or wrongness of a particular worldview or culture, set of beliefs in history? Do you come at it with a Judeo-Christian slant, etc.? So we really felt the weight of this in, I think, our third or fourth American volume with the question of slavery. One of the things that we do, we would call this work latently Christian. We're not preachy. We are assuming that the Judeo-Christian worldview is the correct one. However, part of the, I think, the genius of this curriculum is letting the participants of history speak for themselves. So you will hear from Northern abolitionists that I believe correctly surmise that slavery is from the pit of hell, but you're also going to hear from, you're going to try, the students are going to get into the mind of like, what was going on with Southern slaveholders? How did they justify their position, especially in light of a of a of a of a claimed Christian worldview? Um, and so here it is. Here are the people from these historical epochs giving you their best arguments why they believe what they believe. So that's one of the ways I would answer that question. So yeah, I mean, with a less explosive topic, like I already mentioned, we'll be giving both the loyalist and the patriot side of the American Revolution. You'll hear from one chapter that the patriots are just absolute rebels, vile people, and you'll hear the opposite when you read somebody like Thomas Paine. You'll hear the very opposite, that no, it's actually Great Britain that are the devilish villains in this story. And students are going to have to weigh those two sides and all these things. So we're actually teaching virtue through these series. We're teaching you how to wrestle with deeply moral questions, something I never got in history class. My history class in high school, all 4 years, was just a teacher sitting up and literally reading the textbook. It was intolerable. But to wrestle with deeply moral issues, to understand that the primary use of history is not only to know the story, the unfolding narrative, but like Livy said, to give us lessons of things to emulate and vile things to run from, and to learn from history, to learn from those who have done well and those who have made terrible mistakes. That's the value of a humanities-based history course.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that you've just touched on is what we might call a charitable hermeneutic, right? Learning how to read something that you might disagree with an eye to actually understanding it, right? Like, one of the things that's so prevalent right now is dismissing out of hand somebody that you disagree with, right? So if we move to ancient Greece and Rome, where we think everybody's everybody's wrong about everything, or where everybody's right about everything, we don't present the poets as being wrong and the philosophers as being right. We don't present, so a lot of it has to deal with learning how to inhabit a text from the inside out, learning how to understand it on its own terms. And if you're going to disagree with it, that's fine, but you should at least be able to articulate what Homer says and why it seems like he says it before you articulate what you think is wrong with that. So I think that's one of the really nice things about a primary text-based curriculum too. So I think charity and humility, right? Like, it's so easy. We call this, what did Chesterton call this? Chronological snobbery. It's so easy to assume that because we came after that we know more, which I suppose is a form of post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, right? But who's right, Plato or Aristotle? One answer to the question is we don't know. We want students to be able to read Plato and think about if Plato is internally consistent. Then we want students to read Aristotle and think about if he's internally consistent. Then we want students to be able to put Plato and Aristotle in conversation with each other and see what comes out of that. And if you can learn how to do this with a text, then you can learn how to do it with people. So now you can begin speaking with people in your own life with whom you disagree. And you can learn how to engage dialectic with them without dismissing them or belittling them, or, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful if our students leave and actually have learned how to engage people that think differently than they do? So that's a big benefit.
Yeah, it reminds me that, like, Nate might have an opinion about Plato and Aristotle, but he didn't come to that because he heard a lecture and someone just told him what to think. So it's just not appropriate to go right to the conclusion of, what do you think, teacher? And we have to construct these things carefully under the lordship of Christ as Christians. If you're in the Christian tradition, but with humility and charity. So that is a pedagogical approach you'll see just embedded throughout the text. It's in the tone of what we've created. Now, I want to just share the screen briefly just to remind you that you can learn more at any time by going to the CAP website. That we have, you just go under products, and then Humanitas will pop up, and then you can see everything. Whoops, sorry about that. You can see everything that we offer, but if you click this Learn More button, you're going to see some other resources that go deeper, similar to what we're trying to do today. This, for example, is I believe this is going to be Nate.
When we read primary sources, we work hard to inhabit the sort of framework in which.
Yeah, you're going to hear some of the same things, only he wears a tie this time. There's good resources for you here that you can pass around, share with people, at your school or homeschool community. So to know that we already have some good resources online on the web, and then we're going to archive this and make this available as well. So if you found that this was really helpful, well, you'll get a link and you can share it with people who are part of your leadership team and so forth. Okay, let's take one more question, and I think we're going to kind of round down to the end. If you have more, put them in the chat box, because we are coming towards the end. But Joshua has a question up. How do the textbooks aim to facilitate further engagement for the teacher or student with the sources beyond what's in the book?
Well, I mean, they're literally a further reading list in a certain sense, right? So we've already mentioned things like the Federalist Papers. So we have excerpts from a few of the Federalist Papers. You want to engage that further. The next step is to read the full letter, right? So I think we have excerpts from 2 or 3 in the American volumes. And then you might be able to go forward and say, okay, what if I bought the entire collection of the Federalist Papers? So same thing with, like we think about ancient Greece and Rome, there's going to be sources. Chris mentioned Lex Rex, he mentioned Hall's Chronicles. There are all sorts of suggestions in terms of where to go. So I've never read Hall, and now I know about him because he was here in the volume. We also are going to, I mean, it kind of changes depending on where you look, right? But we're also going to have places in the Greece volume, for instance, which I've just been working on, where a text from Cicero, some of the annotations will point you towards further texts. So here he seems to be synthesizing Aristotle and the Ethics, and then there's a reference, so you can actually go and read what Cicero was thinking about. So there's a lot of things like that. Chris, you have any other ideas? I guess I'm not entirely sure what else that question might be asking. Facilitate further engagement with the sources. I suppose we need to start having webinars where we invite teachers to discuss the primary sources. And then a week later, they can teach those primary sources. That's what we should do. Oh, dear. Yeah, Genius. They'd be helpful for teacher professional development too. So if you could get your whole department to discuss a text, that's something that's a great idea. Sorry, Chris, didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's good. Yeah, I know when I was new to the movement, that's now about 17 years ago, I think the question was like, where do I get more? It was, where do I get less? So like I remember, Omnibus, when they would introduce like Eusebius's History of the Church, a book that had a profound impact on my life. I don't like, we have limited time in the classroom. So instead of, here would be the difference between Humanitas and a work like that. Instead of reading 2 weeks of the martyrs giving their lives, like what we want to do in Humanitas is we want to select like the most powerful anecdotes from one of these Roman persecutions and have students chew on that for one class. And then if they want to go on and read all of Eusebius, great. That they can do that. But I think teachers will catch very easily in the annotations, particularly in the history highlights. The history highlights is probably in some ways one of the coolest features of this book, of these volumes, and we haven't really talked a lot about it. It gives students this anecdotal break from reading these texts, and they can just say, hey, what was being invented at this time? What scientific discoveries were being made? So those could be springboards to launch into many inquiries. And these are so well written, and they're so pithy, and they're written in a journalistic style. Yeah, they're just so fun. One of the guys that wrote the history highlights for one of the American volumes, Dr. Matt Stewart, he's one of my colleagues here at Ambrose. He's the editor for Front Porch Republic. I said, Matt, your history highlights are going to go down in American lore. They're just so enjoyable and funny to read. So the students will love those.
Yeah, I'll just append a comment that to what both of you said, that Nate used the metaphor of tasting and seeing. If you can give the students, say, a taste of Benjamin Franklin in the excerpt, or one of the Federalist Papers, and as we recommend, you actually give these texts to students to own, so it's part of their library building process as young scholars. We would hope they would be writing in this book and in owning this book, possessing this book. If they get excited by Ben Franklin's, the excerpt that we have, we would hope that students will start to love that thing, love the beauty and goodness of, in this case, Franklin, that they would want to go read, even if it's just pleasure reading, outside reading, that they would acquire a taste for Franklin, that's what they want to do when they have free time. That's studying what you love, and that's an indication that education in the most profound sense is actually happening. They're becoming humanized. Their loves and affections are being cultivated to love the right things, the lovely things. So we hope that this collection can be a part of that. That this is not the end of their study. It's really it's a portal into the museum. We're bringing them into the museum of learning and giving them a guided tour of a museum that's massive, and that's why it's curated, so that they won't get lost in the Met or the British Museum. Because if you go into the British Museum or the Met in New York without any preparation or guidance, you'll just get vertigo and leave and say something like, I did the Met, and you won't go back. But if you go with a good tour guide who guides you through and preps you and doesn't let you stay, takes you to the right places at the right time, you'll go back and back to the Met. You'll want to explore every room, and you'll want to drink deeply in various rooms. I went into the Roman coin collection at the Met, and I love Roman coins. But I could not get out of that room. It's like, I could spend my life here, just here. Or if you like Egyptian mummies, well, you go to the Egyptian section. They don't just have one mummy there. They have like 13. And they have a reconstructed Egyptian temple in the Met. So you need to be guided or you will get lost. But at any rate, I hope this has been helpful to you, and we're just grateful for your time. We're grateful for what you as teachers are doing in whatever field you're serving. And as Chris has already given you his email, and you can reach out to Nate and me as well. I'm Perrin at classicalsubjects.com. He is Antiel at classicalsubjects.com. You can reach out to Megan and any of our sales staff. Megan, handing it back to you, but how would you like to direct everybody now that we're finishing up?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate hearing from all of you guys. I'll just give us some ending notes here, and I'll also put my email in there as well, just in case you want to connect with anyone else at CAP. I can hook you up with them. But let's see here. So I have a few things here that can kind of, let me share my screen here, give you a better idea of what's coming at CAP and some other related texts and things of that sort. Let's see. Share screen. There we go. There we go. So first of all, we have our slide for Humanitas here. So obviously we've just spent a while hearing about this, but just wanted to include it here. So you can, if you want at any point to visit the site, humanitashistory.com will take you right there. And then I've also included the links in our chat below. And then also on Tuesday, I will be sending a recording out to you of this webinar. And in that, I will include links to the Learn More page with Nate's videos and links to the site there. But some more things at CAP that will interest you here. If it will let me change slides, there we go. First is classicalU.com. So this is where we have professional development courses with some of the biggest minds in classical education right now. You can hit there at classicalU.com. I believe there is a trial period if you wanted to just get a taste there, but we have, I know Chris Perrin has quite a few courses on there, and some other thinkers on related people in Humanitas as well. I believe there's one on Homer, there's one on Boethius. So if there's anything that strikes you, or any of the teachers at your school, there's some currently about those. So if that interests you, just feel free to jot down classicalU.com. And then the other primary thing we have going on here at CAP is we have Scholé Academy. So this is a place where you can find courses for any homeschoolers. So we have enrollment for fall 2023 courses open now, but we have history courses there from ancient to modern, anything in between, and also literature courses and a lot more of the interdisciplinary take that Chris and Nate have told you about here. So hopefully Humanitas will enter that as well as it becomes more into fullness. And then last year, I just wanted to end with The Curious Historian is coming out with its new edition. This is the Rome edition. So if you are teaching history and aiming at lower grades here, this will be a good resource for you. So just keeping in line with history in general, just wanted to include this here. But yeah, and then also just stay tuned. I don't have a slide for it, but next week on August 4th, we'll have Nathan Carr giving a talk about his brand new book, Festive School. So that is, so be sure to keep an eye out for the register link. I'll include that for you in the email as well on Tuesday. But other than that, thank you to our whole panel here. Appreciate hearing from all of you. And yeah, keep an eye out for Tuesday when I'll send you the recording, and I want to thank all of you.
Thank you, Megan. And thanks to you, Chris and Nick, for your time today too. And once again, to all of you who joined us today, really appreciate your time with us. Have a great rest of the week. Good weekend to you.
Thank you.